My name is Wayne Keynes, Minister of National Security. Since 2009, 35 young men have been shot and killed. 92 people have been injured by illegal firearms. And over 400 of our young people are at risk of getting involved in gangs. Bermuda, we don't have to be defined by our past statistics.
Give a thought to grief recovery and how we in Bermuda perceive grief. The Grief Recovery Institute describes grief as the normal and natural reaction to loss of any kind. Grief is emotional, not intellectual. Grief is individual and relates directly to the uniqueness of all human relationships. Grief is a crisis, and in a crisis we tend to go back to our oldest, longest held beliefs that relate to dealing with loss of all kinds. Grief affects each person differently. Therefore, the application of ideas about grief is different. What grief is not? Grief is not orderly, nor does it have a predictable conclusion. Grief is not rational. Grief is not a disease or an illness.
He would rather have correction by his dad than to have lost him and feel the hurt that he is feeling because he lost his father. And that was like, wow, how do you deal with this, or who could fix this?
And there was no go-to how-to manual to deal with this level of grief.
One might ask, why is it necessary to address grief and trauma in a timely manner? Grief recovery practitioners note that the side effects from unresolved grief can be devastating.
Trauma from violence and trauma in general has a huge impact on the family, because studies show that trauma, when it happens to anybody, rewires their brain. It hurts parts of their brain in development, and your brain really has to be rewired when that happens. So imagine a child experiencing any kind of trauma, their brain, certain parts of the brain stop firing to each other.
In terms of thinking about impacts of any kind of loss, you're thinking about whether or not those losses have a response to them, and whether or not communities are actually connecting to not only the event that has happened, but also to healing and the resources, and really opening up dialogues, opening up pathways for young people and families and agencies and organizations to really connect.
People need proper grief training, not just constant run-of-the-mill, but proper grief training to know what the steps are. Also to have tools to be able to give our children to be able to cope with it.
I just couldn't feel that. But then a voice said to me, take him. So I called him. And he ended up getting the counseling that he needed. Well, that was the best thing that I could have done, because it opened the way for me to deal with myself and to deal with the rest of my siblings. And little did I know that it was going to have such a profound effect on us.
There must be a concerted effort to prevent depression, withdrawal, isolation, and inappropriate acting out behavior, lack of interest in schoolwork, promiscuous behavior, and other related devastating results of unaddressed and unsupported grief and loss. The grief recovery method sets out first to dispel a few myths, such as time heals all wounds, and instead teaches us to replace the myths with practical guidance for our children.
My name is John James, and I started the Grief Recovery Institute over 30 years ago as a result of the death of a son in 1977. I, like many other people that I've met over the years, had made the assumption that because loss was such a common occurrence, that there would be people who were trained and to know how to help. And sadly, what I discovered is that most of the help that people offered was intellectual in nature, and my brain wasn't really broken, it was my heart. So over a period of about 8 months, I discovered a process that helped me to feel better.
When John James created the phrase grief recovery back in the late 70s, almost no one had ever heard the words grief and recovery in the same sentence. And people would say to us, is recovery even possible? To this day, some people still contest it. But we discuss it with them, we argue it with them, and we show them from our own personal experience, from our own losses, how we have recovered and regained a sense of well-being in our lives in spite of the losses that have happened.
The concept that we were operating with at the time was, how do you deliver grief recovery assistance to the largest number of people in the shortest period of time? Consequently, the first obvious thing was write a book. The first book was the Grief Recovery Handbook, which is now in its 4th edition, the 20th anniversary edition, that has been translated into multiple languages. Our book, When Children Grieve, also has been translated into multiple languages. And a third book, called Moving On, deals with the enormous sadness that revolves around divorce and romantic relationships that don't survive even to the point of a marriage. But even with a book, you're only going to reach a certain number of people. And so we then decided that we would create these grief recovery outreach programs, which are moderated recovery groups where people take very specific actions to heal their heart.
The really neat part is we give a practical, applicable set of actions people can take rather than sitting and waiting to feel better, which most people do because that's what they were taught. So the key here is actions to feel better or different than we felt and not be paralyzed into inaction, which keeps us stuck forever.
In a Bermuda where broad daylight gun violence leading to death is a reality, children often carry the burden of undetected grief and trauma. While mothers directly impacted by gun violence speak to the upheaval in the family unit and the fallout from grief and trauma.
Stages of grief come in different times, and it's going to be a long process, and so the lines of communication really have to be
There
open.
is a great need for us to fix our problem. The children are struggling. Families are struggling. They may not have, I could see that they have not been afforded the counseling, grief counseling. That's what we need in our schools.
To better serve those we endeavor to assist, we have secured certification in grief recovery. We propose to equip groups such as yours with the tools to better assist those under your guidance. To facilitate the proposed training, we will provide joint training sessions led by our overseas partners and facilitated by those of us duly certified in the grief recovery method.